Amen. You may take a seat. And as you take your seat, if you can grab your Bible and open up to the book of Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew and a couple of other places over the course of the next few weeks. This is Matthew chapter 28. I guess this whole 5-week series is underpinned by these verses. I'm going to read from verse 16, and just to set the context, these are some of the final words that Jesus says to the 11 disciples after his resurrection, just before he's taken back up into heaven, having completed the task that God sent him to earth for. And these final words of Jesus would be the mantra by which the 11 disciples would then spread the message of Christianity with such courage and commitment. And its transformative message would still be changing lives today, more than 2,000 years later. So let's have a look. Matthew 28, verse 16. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Are these familiar words to you? Familiar to some people? Yes, good. We're allowed to interact. I know we're very good Baptists, but you are allowed to talk. Very familiar words, aren't they? I wonder if you can recall how many sermons you've heard on a passage like this. Lots. I wonder if you can recall. Was that 11? That's a very good recollection. I wonder if you can recall the way these words made you feel or how they impacted your heart. As we begin the series this morning, which we've been advertising for a few weeks now, this series, even as Pastor Laurie said today, it's a 5-week series that's going to run both as a sermon series at our large church gatherings, that is here on a Sunday, and also in our small church gatherings, our life groups throughout the week. And the idea of this series is that we might be reminded again that these words might be transforming and motivating and encouraging our hearts again, because they really are what we're supposed to be on about. And we need to keep this main thing the main thing. And so it's so important as a church that we begin the year with a series like this. So as individuals and Christians and followers of Jesus and as his church, we're pointed in the right direction. And this series is called Plan A. It's centered around the Great Commission, those words that I just read. It's called Plan A because we regularly need the reminder that Jesus' plan for you and for me is that we would go into the world or into our sphere of influence and make disciples. If you're unsure as to why you are living on this planet, put simply, your purpose is to love Jesus and to point other people to him through the way that you live. That is the way that we think, the renewing of our mind, the way that we speak and the way that we act. The one thing that is of utmost importance while you're alive, and the one thing that you can no longer do after you're dead, is tell people about Jesus. Outreach, discipleship, evangelism, it's called all sorts of different things, but this is God's plan A for your life. It's spelled out really clearly to the 11 who were standing in Jesus' presence that day. And what we need to understand through this series is that there is no plan B. The notion of making disciples is something that Christians before each of us have taken seriously, and we really should stand here today and thank God that they did take it seriously, because as a result, you are sitting in this church. Christians for generations before us, probably many of them dead and gone to heaven, took the Great Commission of Matthew 28 so seriously that they lived their lives in such a way that it pointed people to Jesus, and as a result, you are here. They saw it as a commission, not just a suggestion, and somehow, some way, through the work of the Spirit, tens of millions of people on the earth across the generations have responded to the call to follow Christ. This is God's plan A. There is no plan B. And if you're taking notes, can you just put that, if you get nothing else today, there is no plan B. You are it. What's important for us to note is that our culture is shifting at a rapid pace. And that means we may not be using the same tools that we did in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. I mean, I don't know, does anyone have, you know those really old school phones where you have to like, does anyone still use one of those? No, because times have changed. In fact, many households don't even have a phone. We're all just using our mobiles. And so in the same way, we have to think about how we share our faith that's applicable and adaptable to our culture and to each one of us. I remember in the late 90s when I was at university, the 4 spiritual laws tract. Knowing God personally. Does anyone remember that? Like that was the Become a Christian, that was the Mecca document. That was it. It was the one. And I remember as part of a campus group, a Christian group on campus, they had us memorize it, and we had to walk up to people in the cafeteria and say, do you know Jesus? And sprout off the 4 spiritual laws. And I sort of sound a little bit like I'm mocking it, and I don't want to do that because it was actually quite transformative for me to understand the gospel and be able to communicate it. I'm not saying that that's bad or wrong, but what I'm saying is I wonder whether that style of outreach and evangelism is going to work today. And so in these 5 weeks of Plan A, we're going to look at some principles of disciple making rather than saying, let's box ourselves into one tool, go and use this tool. And the 5 principles that we're going to cover are these, and yes, they all rhyme: growing, knowing, sowing, rowing, and showing up. And we're going to see that if we take Jesus' plan to seriously go, to take that seriously, that we might go, verse 19 of Matthew 28, go into all the world. If we're taking that seriously, it involves growing personally. It involves knowing and sowing and rowing and showing up. You have to understand all of these principles if you want to take Jesus' plan A seriously to make disciples. Now, I don't want to say too much about each of the principles because I don't have time, but we will look at them in depth each week. But I will say that these principles of faith sharing are found in different places through the Gospels and the book of Acts. And also it's important to know that all of these 5 principles may be implemented in different measures. They're not implemented equally all of the time. Let me give you an example. When there is a tin of Milo in my pantry, often my son, maybe your kids or grandkids, think the same thing, that you need to have equal proportions of Milo and milk. But it's kind of not the way you're supposed to drink Milo, although it's really good, let's be honest. And so it's kind of the same thing. When we're making disciples, different situations and circumstances call for an emphasis on maybe 1 or 2 of these principles rather than jamming all 5 in at once. And we're going to see that through this journey. And the final thing to say about these 5 principles before we get into my real sermon, this is not my time, by the way, this is pre-sermon. The final thing to say is that this isn't a 5-step program. So we don't kind of graduate step 1 and then we move to the next step. The way that we live out Plan A for you is going to look different to someone else. In fact, it should look different to someone else because you have a different personality to the person sitting next to you. You have a different spiritual gifting and you're in a different stage of life and you have different opportunities to everyone else in this building. It's going to look different, and that's good. It's not designed, these 5 weeks, to be a set program, but rather to be principles to help us share our faith in a way that works for you. And so we should be always considering, which principle do we need to give more attention to as we journey this thing called life? Put simply, the gospel is that Jesus Christ, the ruler of everything, has died and has been raised to life in order to defeat sin and death and their impact on us and their impact on our relationships and their impact on our planet. And Jesus invites you to be part of his plan to set the world right. To be a disciple of Jesus means not only do we trust Jesus to save us, but we learn from him how to live. We learn a new way of being loved and giving love. We learn a new way of being a neighbor and a family member and a caretaker of this world. And I wonder, as the disciples stood there in that moment at the mountain in Galilee, and as Jesus comes to them and shares this mantra, this great commission on there, and places it on their shoulders, I wonder if they knew, how on earth are we going to do this? You see, the thing is, we can look at the 11 disciples and think, wow, that's heavy. They didn't really get that many instructions other than to just go and do it. How did Jesus ever think this plan A was going to work? But you know what they did have? They had 3 years living alongside Jesus, walking in the dust of his sandals, being challenged and being taught by him. 3 years of giving them instructions and principles, and 3 years training them in what discipling might look like. And this is where we start this morning, because the disciples were constantly growing in their understanding and knowledge of who Jesus was, which of course meant when it came time for them to tell people about him, they had a pretty good base to speak from. Jesus' teaching to the disciples and many others who were there at the time, it started long before Matthew 28. And so I want you to turn back to Matthew 5 for me. Matthew 5, and at this stage, Jesus, if you flip around Matthew 5, you'll see he has called some disciples and he begins to preach, and there are crowds of people that are starting to follow him. And this is the beginning, or it's part of the Sermon on the Mount, or the collection of sermons. And Jesus begins with some powerful illustrations of what life might look like as a follower of Jesus, then and now. And it's one of the centerpiece passages that we're going to look at as we consider this principle of growing. Let's have a look together, Matthew 5. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." There are 3 ideas that we can see, 3 challenges that we see that directly relate to this principle of growing for us this morning. Firstly, the challenge is that we might be growing like Jesus in our character. It's actually not enough to get to a certain place in your relationship with Jesus and then just coast along for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter how old you are or how long you've been a Christian. And while it might even be amazing, it's not even kind of relevant enough if you've led 50 people to the Lord 20 years ago. How many people are we pointing to Jesus now because of our character? Here's a question that I want to ask you, and I asked of myself this week. When was the last time you saw someone take a step to follow Christ because of you? isn't that a hard-hitting one? The challenge, and ably supported by the Holy Spirit, is that we might be in a lifelong process of being made more like Jesus. Also at university, as a naive but reasonably confident 17-year-old, I remember rocking up to my first lecture at QUT, the University for the Real World. And one of the first things that they said, in fact, one of the main things that they said the entire faculty was on about for the 4 years of my double degree, was that as educators, it is absolutely necessary. In fact, it is imperative, they said, that you consider yourself a lifelong learner. They said, as teachers, there will always be things that you will need to learn and adapt to. And as a very naive 17-year-old, I remember sitting there thinking, there are 4 years of study ahead of me, and with all the money that I'm about to pay you, I really just want you to give me the things that I need to know. Just tell me everything, give it to me now, and then I'm going to be ready to face this world of high school students. Well, of course, fast forward 4 years, my first week on the job, and I realized how much really they didn't teach. And 20 years later, I'm still learning. I'm still growing, still adapting, still experiencing things and being stretched. You see, my lecturers at QUT absolutely had it right. We are to be lifelong learners. And so if you think you're at a stage in life, or you've been on this Christian journey for a really good amount of time and you think, I'm going pretty well, the challenge this morning is that we might continue to be growing. When it comes to knowing more about Jesus, experiencing him, understanding him, living for him so that our character can emulate him, we're called to be growing. And the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 give us some really good examples of what following Jesus look like, but it also gives us a challenge. If we want growth in our character, Jesus says these are the things that you need that will bring you growth and blessing. The Beatitudes, they give us this picture of what people who belong to the King are like, because you are less likely to win people over with some persuasive speech or a logical argument if they can see that you have a gaping hole in your character. You can say all the eloquent words that you want, but people out there are looking for authenticity. They're looking for integrity. They want to know that your character stacks up to this gospel that you're preaching. And so Jesus says, if you want that to be the case, pursue a life that's poor in spirit. And that essentially means you're someone who depends on God. You're not self-righteous. You need a dependence on him. He says, yearn to be someone who is open and honest. Yearn to be someone who's meek or gentle. Yearn to be someone who seeks to do what's right in God's eyes. That's what it means to hunger and thirst for righteousness. Yearn to be someone who shows mercy to others. That is, and we've talked about this in our mercy series, compassion and forgiveness when it's within your power to punish or harm someone. Yearn to be someone whose heart is pure before God, someone who will pursue and promote peace, someone who will stand and be counted as a Christian even if it means ridicule or persecution. Jesus is saying these are the types of people who belong to him, and he is going to send out these people into the world. If you want to be serious about God's plan A, if you want 2023 to be a year where you see someone come to faith personally, then it has to start with our character, that we might be growing. Because if these Beatitudes are a list of anything, they are a list of what Jesus is like. The character of Christ, how he lived and died. And one person put it this way, when Jesus hung on the cross, was there anyone else in the world who was poorer in spirit? Anyone who mourned more, anyone more meek, anyone more hungry and thirsty for righteousness, anyone more pure in heart, anyone more committed to peacemaking, or anyone more persecuted? See, Jesus lived and died in order to bring about change in our world, and he wants his disciples, that is us, to pick up our cross daily and grow in our character, that we might be more like him. And when this happens, we point people to Jesus. They see that we're different. Do you want this year to be a year where you point someone to Jesus? Do you want this year to be a year where you point someone to Jesus? Yes, absolutely we do. Plan A starts with our character, growing in Jesus. Our community, your friends, your neighbors, I can assure you they do not need half-hearted religious people who will just give up a few hours on Sunday. They need authentic followers of Christ. That's what it's going to take. Are we willing to grow to be more like Christ? Of course, our character isn't just something inside us. Our character flows from us into our conduct, which is the second area of growth. And so in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, as Jesus gathers his disciples and as the crowds are sitting and listening to him preach, he doesn't just preach about the Beatitudes and their character. The very next thing he challenges them with is about how they conduct themselves. And this is what he says. Verse 13, Matthew 5, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they might see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Over the last few years, I've recorded a couple of sermons for 96.5 for their Sunday celebration program. And one of the messages I gave was on this passage. I know it's been aired a couple of times, and I apologize if you may have heard me say this next little bit already. But did you know that over the years, salt has played a really significant part in society? Wars have been fought over salt. Venice and Geneva fought a war over salt. Salt played an important part in the American Revolution. The voyages of Christopher Columbus are said to have been financed by salt production, and the oppressive salt tax in France was one of the causes of revolution. In ancient times, salt was seen as a necessity of life because its seasoning and persevering qualities. It was one of the most highly prized materials, and it became a trading commodity. They didn't have refrigerators or cooling systems like we have now, and so when meat was bought at market, it was packed very heavily with salt to preserve its freshness prior to being stored so the meat wouldn't go off. In some societies, salt was so highly valued that it was used as money. And even today, there is an Arab saying that says, "There is salt between us." And this means we are now friends. Where perhaps you hadn't been friends with someone, you might sit down to have a meal with your enemy, and if there was salt between you, it was an indication of your intention to now be friends where once you had been enemies. Salt has healing properties. If you have an infection in your eye, you can remedy that by bathing it in salt. Unrefined sea salt is known to pull toxins from our bodies if we add it to our bath water. And Jesus is deliberately using an analogy to describe what our conduct should look like. For those of us who want to take plan A and being disciples seriously, making disciples this year, Jesus says, be salt. Season the world with your conduct. With your speech, with your actions, preserve the kingdom of God. Bring healing through God's love and truth to the people around you through the way you conduct yourself. Brennan Manning, an American author, public speaker, and a lay priest, he wrote these very hard-hitting words. He says, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." So let's be salt. Let's be salt in the way that we think and live, that the world may know we are his disciples. Jesus also says, be light. He says, you are the light of the world. And in the Bible, light is a divine presence. Do you remember, not that long ago, although it seems like a distant memory if everyone's back at work, that thing we celebrated in December, Christmas? There's a bright light that led the Magi to baby Jesus. And as a man, when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain, a great light surrounded him and Peter and James and John. If you remember the story of the Apostle Paul, as he's walking down the road to Damascus, a light shone on him that was blinding. Light is significant. In John 8:12, Jesus himself says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. So if you're a Christian today, you have that light. But interestingly, here in John 8:12, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. But in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, what does he say? He says, you are the light of the world. And he says this because he wants us to understand we are recipients of his light. Jesus has passed on the light to you, and you are now the light of the world. And as we look to the source of light, that is Christ, we reflect that source to a world in darkness. Our light shines not so that people will be attracted to us, but they will be attracted to Christ. And a light is there to be seen. It's to provide guidance in a dark night. There's no point having a light and never turning it on. Jesus says a town built on a hill can't be hidden. You can't hide a city on a hilltop or a lighthouse at the edge of a shoreline. Those lights can be seen for kilometers. You are supposed to be shining. In first century Palestine, homes were pretty dark. They were small, they had very few windows, they didn't have electricity and light bulbs like we have there. Light consisted of a lamp, which was a bowl filled with oil with a wick that sat in it. And when night fell, they needed light. And so they would place the bowl on a lampstand to shed some light to the entire house. But the most difficult part about this lamp was actually getting the thing lit. They don't have matches or little things that, pull the trigger and the flame comes out. This is totally different. And so as a result, no one wanted to let the light go out because it took so much work to get the thing going in the first place. But if you were leaving your house for a particular reason in the evening, it was dangerous to leave this flame going. And so for safety, they would take the lamp and they would put it under a stand and they would place a clay vessel over it so that it could burn risk-free. And as soon as someone returned, they'd put the lamp back on the stand. And that's why Jesus says here, no one staying in for the night lights a lamp and then stuffs it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand so that it can give light to the house. And when Jesus gave this example, they knew exactly how absurd that might be. That you would light a lamp, put all the effort into lighting it, and then just cover up the light. How bright is your light shining? As the famous Christian pastor and evangelist John Wesley said, do all the good you can by all means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all times you can, to all people you can, as long as you ever can. So let's be light, carrying the light of Christ, the truth, the hope, the transformative power of the gospel. Shine it brightly for people to see. That's our first two challenges, to be growing like Jesus in our character and growing like Jesus in our conduct. And finally, and much shorter, the challenge is that we might be growing like Jesus in our commitment. At the end of the Beatitudes passage, Jesus says this, let me read it again. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, say falsely all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. One of the challenges of following Jesus and making disciples is that we will get different responses from people. Some people's face will light up as they see and understand the truth of the message and they receive God's blessing and spirit. Other people will do whatever they can to stop anyone following Jesus. They'll do whatever they can to make your life difficult, when they know that you're a Christian. And so the challenge is that we might stick with Christ no matter what, remaining committed despite the challenge you might face. Often people say, I don't share my faith because I feel really inadequately equipped. Like, I don't know what to say to people. I don't know how to answer their questions. And while those sentiments might be true, I wonder if we look deeper within if there is a far greater fear. I wonder if we fear that God might not come through for us in that moment. I wonder if we fear that if we step out and share our faith story, or even just stand up in our workplace and say, I'm a Christian, I wonder if our real fear is that we might be rejected or mocked. And do you know what? That is a very possible outcome. But what if saying something or displaying God's character in a circumstance results in someone not rejecting us and not rejecting the message of the gospel? But instead, what if it results in someone coming to know Jesus for the very first time? What if it results in you personally leading someone to Christ this year? Wouldn't it be worth it? Of course, never forget the Holy Spirit. God himself is with us. He helps us. He gives us courage. He gives us perseverance. And so hold on to that. Hold on to that power and assurance. Trust God in you. Hey, band, come on up. I'm just about done. The question for us as we begin this series is, how much do we want to be on about God's plan A? It's his only plan to use you to make disciples. How much does God's presence in your life compel you to want to live and share this hope with others? And are you willing, as we start, to grow in our character, our conduct, our commitment as lifelong learners? In a tweet a couple of years ago, Caleb Iselli, just a young man who's living for Jesus, he wrote this and he said, I'm not a Christian because I want the reward of heaven. I'm not a Christian because I'm running from hell. I'm a Christian because the character of Jesus Christ is so compelling to me that I want to spend my life chasing it, embodying it, and sharing it. And so if you're serious right here today about chasing, embodying, and sharing Christ, then we have to grow together. And that's why we're saying in this series, join a life group. Be a part of a smaller group of people who can grow with you and alongside you. If you're not in one, come and have a chat with one of us. I know a couple of new groups are, I believe, kicking off, particularly for this series. We'd love to find where you fit. You see, growth doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens best with others in community. And so let's continue to turn up each Sunday. We fellowship, we learn, we worship in this gathered church context. But let's also be part of a smaller group where we can share our burdens and our struggles and grow together. The challenge for us is lifelong learning and lifelong growing. Because that's what we're on about on this earth, to point people to Christ. Can I pray for you as we commit to growing in 2023? I just ask that you might bow your head or close your eyes, quieten your heart, and I want to give you a moment just to consider what aspects of your character or your conduct or your commitment might God be asking you and challenging you to grow in. Why don't you take a moment just to ask the Spirit to illuminate them to you.